Hello everyone. This week we're looking at the idea of agency and what it means to be a public sector agent, and getting all these sort of jokes about secret agents and things out of the way. To start with, the reason secret agents are called secret agents is because they are public agents that happen to be working in secret. So it's not a coincidence that that term is used. It's not one that is used very much in the public domain for several reasons, and I think it's one that we need to take seriously when we start looking at strategy and at the role of the public sector and people who work in the public sector in the field of justice and in the pursuit of justice, because we have a tendency to see everything strictly in terms of employer-employee relationships. So even a person who is a public agent, we tend to kind of just see them as someone who works for the government and therefore are at the whim of the government. And I think that's because capitalism has a particularly vested interest in seeing everyone in that sort of precarious employment. And also in terms of, I think we get a lot of American culture, and Americans have a very suspicious attitude toward government and government agencies, and tend to be cast people who work for government agencies in a very negative light, unless they're law enforcement, and then often they can do no wrong. But anyone who works for like a regulatory agency, we do tend to see them as pernickety people who interfere with people's freedom, rather than people whose role is very important to democracy. And it's very important that we take this kind of an idea of a government or a public agent very seriously, because they have a strong role in making decisions in an autonomous way, in the right way, regardless of pressure, regardless of public pressure, and regardless of pressure from their bosses. And I think Dr. Fauci is an excellent example of, why this is important and how this goes wrong in a society that doesn't value public service. There was a lot of pressure on Fauci to misreport the dangers of COVID, both because the public didn't want to hear it and because the government, particularly the president, didn't want to hear it. And a lot of the debate and the discussion you got from the populist end of things was very much of the, he works for the government, he should just do what he's told to do. And why isn't he just doing what he's told to do? And I think that gets back to the crux of this importance of this notion of agency. Is you need to, when people are public servants, they're given a certain amount of power, they need to exercise it ethically, and we'll come back, put a pin in that in terms of how that power is exercised. But they're also expected to use it autonomously. They're not supposed to be just following what their bosses tell them to do. They need to be making the right sorts of decisions. So this is for anyone from, Dr. Fauci down to, the local dog catcher. It's really important that when someone is given public power and public trust, that they exercise that power in the right way. And this has a pretty significant impact on the way that government operates, and particularly the justice sector operates. And I know we've been talking a little bit about youth crime, and the continuing hysteria around youth crime, which, if we go back to the media unit you studied, it goes back all the way through history. And, we had mods and rockers and bodgies and widgies, and we had punks, and there's always been as long as we've had this notion of youth culture, they've always been seen as dangerous and out of control. So what is the role of people like police commissioners, or the Australian Institute of Criminology, or people who are working for the Justice Department? All those people who have access to the data that says the problem is no different than what it's always been. Is we have to do something. It's something we need to come up with ideas to meet, but there's nothing new under the sun here. What is the role of those people in communicating that when you've got a media, you've got a population, and you've got a political party that are keen to manufacture this fear of crime? And this emphasises the importance of the public sector, of the role of public agents, and particularly agents who have been given power to exercise in an autonomous way. They need to step up, and they need to resist that sort of political pressure. Unfortunately, it doesn't always happen, and unfortunately, when it does happen, as we saw with Dr. Fauci, people say, "Well, that's not your role. You're just to do what you're told because you're just an employee." Whereas, if we think of it through the lens of agency, it's very important that we have people and the entire support of the democratic system, particularly in an environment where the media has so much power, where our state is so complicated and our the public sector is so complicated. It becomes really even more important that we have people who are exercising their power responsibly and autonomously. All right, so we talk about that a little bit in the notes and look at the different, all the different forms of agencies, from individual agents who are like in a position of power through to organisations that have that sort of agency, and the importance of these things to a functioning of a healthy, transparent, open democracy. It always struck me as odd, and it becomes even more odd as an adult looking at the film Ghostbusters, which I'm hoping you're familiar with. Otherwise, there's some homework for you. And one of the major antagonists in Ghostbusters is the guy from the Environmental Protection Agency. And the guy is actually right. Like, the Ghostbusters are extremely irresponsible, and what they're doing does lead to a major disaster. But he's represented all the way through as being this sort of niggly bureaucrat who just wants to shut down their operation. And I think it gives a very interesting, I think it's a great movie, and it's very funny and everything, but it's an interesting little snapshot of the casual way in which public service is just not valued in American culture. And in fact, someone who is doing their job, no matter, whether the guy is annoying or not, is perceived in this sort of negative light. So yeah, we receive a lot of that media, and we unfortunately, I think, are diluting this idea of what public service is, what public agency is, and why it's important. All right. Now, getting to the Ghostbusters critique of what happens when these people are, out of control or whatever. We have a whole body of law that deals with the danger of people who have been given public power exercising it for the wrong reason. And that's administrative law. And I give you a really quick overview of admin law. And it's probably all you really need to know in about page 4 of the notes. So this is an area of law that's been developed to control excessive power by government agents. And there's a whole series of principles that allow for, originally it was judicial review, where you'd go to the courts and say, Mr. Peck from the EPA has gone outside of his power, or he's been biased, or he's exercised his power in the wrong way. And you get a court order to stop that person from doing what they were doing. That was somewhat limited and, of course, extremely expensive to do, and therefore outside the reach of most people. So in Australia, we have forms of what we call administrative review, which are tribunals that look a bit like courts, but they're actually administrative bodies that handle the same kind of questions. They set rules around what public agents can do, how they can exercise the power. And the simple things like, if you can show someone's been biased in the way in which exercise power, you can have the you can have the decision changed. Or if you can show that they didn't base their decision on good evidence, you can have the decision changed. So it's mostly fairly simple, and what you would hope is there, even though it's couched in legalese and all the rest of it. But there's bodies like QCAT in Queensland or the ART at federal level that exist, so you can have a reasonably cheap access to review when, you know, the local government approves a 10-story tower block next door or whatever, and you can go and have that decision reviewed. So I think it's really important that you are familiar with the idea of admin law and what it does. It's probably not worth studying at any great depth as a law student would, but at least knowing that it's there and it's a remedy that's available. And if you do become someone who is a public agent who is given power to exercise, to be familiar with it and to know that your decisions can be reviewed if you don't base them on good evidence, if you show bias in your process, if you go outside of the power as it was given to you, or you use the power for a purpose other than what it was, and all the other rules that are involved in admin law. It's something that most people just don't know about. And I know I work for a public body, I work for a university, and it does frustrate me at times that people who work in the university system don't know just the basics of this, because universities are bound by the same rules. They're bound by those same laws. You know, we can't, even down to something simple like marking, we have to do it on the basis of good evidence. We can't do it in a way where we're biased in our approach. All those sort of things apply to us just as they apply to the police commissioner, they apply to the local dog catcher, they apply to the the local planning authority, all throughout the public sector. Now, the reading for this week continues the theme we started last week, where we looked at the collaborations between public and private sector. And I think this week we have a slightly different perspective on it, because not only is it looking at situations where you've got a conflict of interests in these relationships, particularly between economic development and social justice, but when we are viewing it through this idea of public agency, well, to what extent can the government make a corporation an agent, or the employees of an organisation an agent, and what does that mean for oversight and our fundamental ideas of responsibility if we start doing things like we looked at last week with the public development corporations, where you have policing handed over to private security. Serious issues raised by that, and the reading for this week also goes into that, I think, and talks about through the concept of entanglement, which I think is a great word to use. What happens if there's no clear guidance, and what happens where the corporation obviously is going to be trying to maximise the economic outputs of a particular relationship, but how, when you've got an important social justice agenda, as they do in South Africa, I mean, we do everywhere, but in South Africa it's actually strongly written into their laws. What does it mean for the way in which you form and monitor these relationships, these agreements and contracts or whatever with the public sector, with the private sector? So it's a topic which I think is one that on the surface sounds a little dull, but when you get into it, and when you get into some of the dystopian things that can happen, you very quickly end up in a sort of a cyberpunk dystopian world where governments are just giving all this power over to corporations who are exercising it in ways that are not consistent with democracy. So I think it's an area that, and I think its overall kind of sense of boringness is one thing that allows a lot of this to happen under the table, because people go, oh God, local government, corporate economic development arrangements, that sounds like the most boring thing ever. And it can be very easy to obscure some of the dodgy things that are happening under this sort of cover of boredom. So we, in the challenge for this week, we take that further and we look specifically at a memorandum of understanding as a form of agreement that devolves a certain amount of power to a corporation, and the way in which this agreement document is expressed in legalese and in a very sort of boring way can actually contain all kinds of pitfalls and all kinds of things that people should be aware of, but often aren't, because they take one look at this stuff and they go, "Oh, my eyes are just glazing over. I can't go any further." But it is worth taking that detailed, focused analysis of it, seeing what's actually going on. All right, so we will talk about that again next week.